Hello, this is an introduction to the global carbon reward and the carbon pricing matrix. This video presentation expands on the shorter 7-minute presentation by including more theory and policy details. The global carbon reward is a market-based policy for mitigating climate change, and the carbon pricing matrix is a diagram that explains how the global carbon reward relates to other market policies. The matrix is also used to describe and explain the utility of the various ways to price carbon. In this 17-minute presentation, I will introduce some key concepts behind the carbon pricing matrix and the new climate policy. Let's start by describing the carbon pricing matrix. The matrix is structured around 2 rows and 2 columns. The 2 rows are denoted as carrots and sticks. Carrots and sticks are the 2 key options for the store of value of the instruments that are used to create these market-based policies. Carrots represent positive incentives and sticks represent negative incentives. The columns of the matrix are denoted as fiat on the left and carbon on the right. These represent the 2 main options for the unit of account of the instruments that are used to hold and trade value. Let's consider the carbon tax first. It occupies the bottom left quadrant of the matrix. So the carbon tax is a stick because it creates a negative price signal and the carbon tax is paid in national fiat currency. The bottom right corner of the matrix is occupied by cap and trade, also called the Emissions Trading Scheme or ETS in Europe. The reason it occupies that quadrant is because the instrument is a pollution allowance. The pollution allowance can be traded and it has units of carbon by mass. The top left corner of the matrix is occupied by the carbon subsidy. It's a carrot. It's a positive incentive and it's paid by government using national fiat currency or as a tax deduction denominated in the national currency. This leaves one more policy to complete the carbon pricing matrix. This is where we introduce the new policy called a global carbon reward. A carbon reward is a carrot, but it is unique because the instrument that is used to pay the reward is indeed a carbon currency. It's a currency denominated in carbon mass units. So that's the carbon pricing matrix, which is framed by 2 of the major functions of money. 1, the store of value, and 2, the unit of account. Let's now have a closer look at the carbon tax. The tax is also called a Pigouvian tax because it is explained using the theory of Arthur Pigou. Pigou's approach is to use a tax to price the negative externalities that are created by private producers of goods and services. The negative externality is the unwanted cost imposed on society by carbon emissions. The tax is set by government and the quantity of emissions is then discovered when the tax is introduced. According to Pigou's theory, the carbon subsidy should be evaluated from a positive externality that is in undersupply. In reality, governments don't evaluate any specific positive externality based on Pigou's theory. Instead, they provide subsidies to support nascent industries, to complement taxes, to unlock investment, to encourage research and development, and to create jobs. An example is the 45Q tax credit for carbon sequestration in the United States. Cap and trade, on the other hand, uses a different approach to Arthur Pigou. It's based on introducing pollution allowances, which are designed by governments to limit the quantity of pollution, called a cap. The allowances are then sold, auctioned, or given away to polluters in a given marketplace. The polluters trade the pollution allowances with each other to discover a price for the fixed amount of pollution. This is called Coasian bargaining, and it requires clear ownership and low transaction costs for the trading of the allowances. Now, let's consider the carbon reward. Here we're using a carbon currency to reward the climate mitigation services that are needed to achieve a specific climate mitigation objective. A specific positive externality is defined. the provision of preventative climate insurance. The process of implementing the reward begins by evaluating the target mass of carbon that should be mitigated. This is the mass of carbon emissions to be reduced, plus the mass of atmospheric carbon to be removed. Once the mitigation target has been estimated, it's then necessary to offer the carbon currency as a positive financial incentive or reward for these mitigation services. A floor price for the carbon reward will be implemented by central banks. The floor price is the minimum price that is needed to incentivize the target mitigation rate and to meet the climate objective. It is important to note that the actual value of the carbon currency can rise above the floor price that is set by central banks. This can occur when private demand for the carbon currency outpaces central bank demand. The private trading of the carbon currency is an example of Coasian bargaining, but the motivations are not the same as for cap and trade. The Coasian bargaining takes place as private investors are searching for profits in a managed currency bull market. Let's now look more closely at the carbon tax and the new policy called a carbon reward. What's special about the carbon pricing matrix is that it includes a hypothesis that the carbon tax is ideally suited to the task of managing the efficiency of markets, whereas the carbon reward is ideally suited to the task of managing the probability of avoiding unwanted climate change. It's this duality of objectives and the way it's associated with these two policies that differentiates the carbon pricing matrix from the standard theory on market pricing. Considering this is the case, we might ask the question, why would we use a carbon tax to manage the efficiency of markets? The social justification is embodied in the principle called the polluter pays principle, which is well known. The justification for the carbon reward is based on a new principle, which we propose, called the preventative insurance principle. So the social justification for the reward is framed by the concept of insurance, which is used to manage risk. So this is an important point about the entire carbon pricing matrix. The point is we've introduced these two decision paradigms, one being improving efficiency, denoted as yellow, and the other being managing probability, denoted as blue. When economists assess the carbon tax, typically they will use integrated assessment models to provide a best estimate of the social cost of carbon. When the carbon reward is assessed, a different approach will be used. The carbon reward is based on the risk cost of carbon, which is the ideal carbon reward, and it is estimated from risk assessments. It's based on probability density functions for successful climate mitigation. In other words, it's based purely on probabilities. Let's take a closer look now at the social cost of carbon and the risk cost of carbon. What's important to understand about the social cost of carbon, which is shown as a yellow curve, is that the social cost of carbon is time discounted, and it is a negative price because it defines the ideal carbon tax. The risk cost of carbon is not time discounted, and it's a positive price shown as the blue curve. Another major distinction between the social cost of carbon and the risk cost of carbon is that the risk cost of carbon is priced with the carbon currency, which is a tradable instrument. All market actors will be able to trade the carbon currency, if they wish to, by buying it with their national currencies. There's a very important effect that the carbon currency will have on the global financial system, and that is because the exchange rate, or the value, of the carbon currency varies with time. Notably, it will predictably and steadily rise for at least 5 decades this century. This implies that the carbon currency is a valuable asset. In fact, it's an investment-grade currency. The yield, or the appreciation of the currency, from year to year will determine how valuable the carbon currency is to investors. Given that the carbon currency's yield is backed by central banks, it becomes a low-risk investment. For this reason, it will influence what's called the risk-free rate of return in the global financial system. By increasing the risk-free rate of return with the carbon currency, the carbon reward policy can influence investment decisions and consumption decisions everywhere. And this will tend to reduce carbon emissions through increased investment in climate mitigation actions. The carbon reward is useful for managing risks because it provides a policy that can be implemented globally, and it is supported by the world's central banks. It offers scalable targeted finance. There are no direct costs for citizens, businesses, or governments because the costs are monetized. It can resolve time discounting dilemmas because the risk cost of carbon is not time discounted. It can be used to formally address systemic risks, and it funds carbon dioxide removal at the scale needed to achieve the Paris Agreement. What about the other two policies, the carbon subsidy and cap and trade? These policies are not ignored. In fact, these policies can be very useful. What the carbon pricing matrix says about these policies is that they're different to the tax and different to the carbon reward because they are halfway between these two policies in terms of the matrix. Let's look at the carbon subsidy first. When governments introduce carbon subsidies, they do not follow the theory of Arthur Pigou as was originally intended. If they did, then they would need to identify and quantify a positive externality. Instead, carbon subsidies are typically introduced to overcome miscellaneous barriers, such as to support nascent industries, to attract investment, promote research and development, and create jobs. A good example is the 45Q tax exemption in the United States. A key inference is that the actual utility of the carbon subsidy is to manage a combination of costs and risks. This appears reasonable given that the carbon subsidy is halfway between the carbon tax and the carbon reward. Let's focus our attention on the cap and trade policy. The cap and trade is also a useful policy for managing a combination of costs and risks because it introduces new social relationships. For example, a wide range of emissions caps could be considered by policymakers, and so the cap and trade policy creates a political dynamic that is difficult to predict. These observations are consistent with the carbon pricing matrix. Now that we've looked at the four policies, let's consider the carbon pricing matrix in terms of social science experiments on human cooperation. There are at least 3 published studies on the effects of carrots and sticks on human cooperation in competitive games. The finding is that a combination of carrots and sticks achieves an optimum level of cooperation among people. Here, cooperation refers to political cooperation, but it also refers to cooperation all through the economy, including with cultural norms, popular beliefs, investing, media conversations, community projects, and so on. Let's have a look at the carbon pricing matrix in terms of cooperation, starting with the carbon tax. The carbon tax, when applied by itself, is a strong stick. However, the level of cooperation is minimal because it is just a stick. If we introduce cap and trade, in addition to carbon taxes, we may see a marginal increase in cooperation because the cap and trade policy introduces new social and biophysical relationships. Once again, if we introduce the carbon subsidy, this can significantly improve cooperation because we're introducing carrots which help to balance sticks. The carbon subsidy is still far from optimal because we haven't employed the fourth policy of the matrix. The fourth policy, the carbon reward, introduces new social and biophysical relationships that are typical for carrots. This combination of carrots and sticks is much more likely to result in an optimum level of human cooperation. The strength of the carbon pricing matrix is grounded in the objective of achieving the optimum in cooperation based on carrots and stick incentives. Indeed, a key recommendation is to apply the entire matrix of policies. The application of the matrix should be viewed as an iterative process and not a single giant step. Now let's look at carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are controversial. More and more people are discussing the limitations of carbon offsets. There are two offset markets, compliance markets and voluntary markets. How do these offsets fit into the carbon pricing matrix? Let's start with carbon offsets in compliance markets for cap and trade schemes. Polluters may be given the option to buy carbon offsets instead of buying pollution allowances or reducing their emissions. The advantage for polluters is that they can buy carbon offsets to neutralize their emissions, which may be cheaper than actually reducing emissions. So carbon offsets in compliance markets can reduce the mitigation costs for polluters. The downside of this approach is that the mitigation projects will introduce new variables and new risks that would not otherwise exist if the polluter actually reduced their carbon emissions at the source. What about voluntary carbon offsets? Voluntary carbon offsets are decoupled from the carbon pricing matrix because they are not part of any compliance policy. Voluntary offset markets are a positive development because they provide opportunities for citizens and businesses to offset their emissions by buying offsets, at least in theory. In practice, they will introduce new variables and new risks, just as carbon offsets do in compliance markets. A key limitation of voluntary offsetting is that they don't resolve the market failure in carbon. They do not provide an incentive for all market actors to reduce their carbon emissions to net zero. Now that we've covered the theoretical background for the carbon pricing matrix, we'll end this presentation with a short list of items that haven't been covered in this video presentation. The following items may be covered in future presentations. 1. A review of carbon offsetting and why a global carbon reward can fill the finance gap and the governance gap that carbon offsetting cannot fill. A review of the global carbon reward policy in terms of the rules for rewarding cleaner energy production, cleaner business practices, and carbon dioxide removal. 3. A review of the features of the global carbon reward in terms of its scalability, public database for mitigation, and its capacity to maximize co-benefits for communities and ecosystems. 4. A review of the marginal supply-demand curves that are used to define the social cost of carbon and the ideal carbon tax, which forms the standard theory. 5. A review of the supply-demand curves for the risk cost of carbon and the ideal carbon reward, and the probability density function for successful climate mitigation. 6. A review of non-market policies that form the climate policy landscape. 7. A review of the biophysics of civilization in terms of its system boundaries, stocks and flows, dirty growth, and how the carbon pricing matrix can be used to achieve net zero carbon emissions with a much greater probability of success. 8. A review of the concept of a phase plane and a phase space for managing the carbon balance and energy balance of the civilization climate system, which is a complex living system. That concludes this 17-minute introduction to the global carbon reward and the carbon pricing matrix. We hope this has been an interesting experience. Please see the other video presentations and our new website, globalcarbonreward.org, for more information on the carbon pricing matrix and the new climate policy. If you have questions or offers of support, please submit them to info@globalcarbonreward.org. Thank you.